chances are it wouldn't have even had multiple inns, if even a single inn, as the story goes that we often tell around Christmas time of Jesus' birth. But that instead he was born in this tiny little village in the part of the house where the animals slept. In fact, that whole image, that whole story that we normally have of Jesus, of Joseph and Mary going around and knocking on the doors of all the inns in Bethlehem, is probably just reading way more into the story than is actually there. I mean, you'll notice that in the story, what Luke actually says there in verse 6 is, while they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. He doesn't say anything about Mary being ready to give birth right at the moment that they arrived. He simply says that this took place while they were there. So they could have been there for quite some time already before Mary was actually ready to give birth. They could have already been staying somewhere. And furthermore, we find there in the passage this word that's translated as inn in most translations, the place where there was no room. And even my own translation says because there was no room for them in the inn. That's probably not a really good translation of that Greek word. It should probably be translated as guest room or family room. In fact, later on in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke chapter 22, that's exactly how it is translated. In the scene where Jesus sends some of the disciples to go and find the place where they're going to have the Lord's Supper together, their last meal together, the Passover meal, Jesus tells them to ask the man if the guest room has been prepared for them. And it's the exact same Greek word that's translated as inn here in this passage. And so, rather than Mary and Joseph going around knocking on the doors of a whole bunch of inns that probably didn't even exist in Bethlehem, the scenario that probably actually took place here was that they were already staying with family there in the house in Bethlehem. But because everyone had come there for the census, it was simply too crowded for them to stay in the main room or the family room or the guest room or whatever it might have been with everyone else. In fact, it may have simply been out of courtesy to Mary and Joseph so that they would have a place slightly more private away from everybody else while Mary gave birth. And so there was no room for them in the family room or the guest room. And so they stayed with the animals. And in most ancient houses, there was probably a part of the house that was attached. It wasn't a separate building, but was attached there to the main room, and that's where the animals would have slept. And so Mary and Joseph probably spent the night there inside the house, but in the part of the house where the animals slept. And so rather than having his birth announced in the imperial city of Rome or even in Jerusalem and having a big feast and all these important people there, just the opposite happens with Jesus. Jesus, though Luke says that he is the King of Kings, that he is Lord and Savior and Prince of Peace, and that he is the one who is really ruler of the world instead of Caesar, despite all that, Jesus is born in a tiny little village in a place where the animals slept, and he was laid down in the box that the animals ate from. And instead of having important people show up to his birth, according to Luke, the only people who show up are some lowly shepherds. People who could hardly be of any lower status in this society. And they are the ones to come and worship him. In a lot of ways, the story of Jesus' birth summarizes really what is good about the good news that we believe in. That here is this king who is King of Kings and Lord of Lords and is the very Son of God, that he could do whatever he wanted, but instead of clinging to that kingly power, and instead of clinging to his status as God's Son and using that against us as he could have, instead he lowers himself, he humbles himself, he empties himself and becomes nothing. He goes from having the highest status he could possibly have to being a helpless baby, laid in a feeding trough in the middle of nowhere, with shepherds coming as the only ones to worship him. It's really an incredible thing. I mean, the technical term that we use is incarnation, that God himself took on our own human flesh. That is what the miracle of Christmas is. That is what the good news of the gospel is. That's what this is all about. That the one true King, the one true Lord and Savior and Prince of Peace, didn't lord that over us, didn't hold it against us, didn't make us his subjected, weak people, but instead became one of us and walked among us and even died our death so that we might have life. In so many ways, that's the gospel in a nutshell. That's what it's all about. And Jesus calls us to be a part of that same movement, that kingdom that he proclaimed, this kingdom that's defined by this whole idea of emptying oneself. That instead of clinging to status and honor and trying to get the highest position possible or clinging to whatever power or wealth you might have, Jesus calls us to do the same thing that he did, to empty ourselves, to lower ourselves, to humble ourselves, to go to those in our society who might be considered of a lower status and to walk in their shoes, to know what it means to live in their flesh. That's the message of the incarnation. That God has done that for us and that he's calling us to do the same for others. To make the same kind of sacrifice that Jesus made, not only in his death, but even in his birth. Stepping into our world so that he could become one of us and save us. That's the kind of movement that we're called to as the people of God. We're called to be a people who empty ourselves, because that is what our King did for us.